The summer of 1976 sat heavy over the hills in the northern part of Wyoming, the kind of heat that felt trapped in the air no matter how wide the sky stretched. Small towns in that part of the state moved at their usual slow pace. People kept to their routines, pretending life was simple even when it was. The Fowler family lived far enough from town that most people rarely saw them, but not far enough to be forgotten. Folks knew their land because it was old, the kind passed down through generations, and because the dirt road leading to it seemed to swallow anyone who didn't belong. On most days, it was quiet enough there to hear the wind drag itself through the grass. But the day the sheriff's office got the call, that quiet felt wrong, as if the air itself knew something had snapped. When deputies reached the Fowler property, they didn't find noise or chaos waiting for them. Instead, they found stillness, the kind that made your stomach twist. The house stood alone in the middle of an open field, its windows dark, its porch empty. It looked normal at first glance, almost peaceful, but something about the place felt off, like a shadow that didn't match the light around it. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken windows, no blood, nothing told a clear story. But the silence pressed in on the deputies in a way that made every step feel heavier, as if the house was watching them instead of the other way around. The Fowler parents, Harold and June, weren't there. That part wasn't surprising. They often drove into town together for supplies. But what the deputies expected to find were the Fowler children, 3 of them, kids who usually played in the yard or sat on the porch with their books. Instead, the house felt empty, untouched, and strangely cold despite the heat outside. A pot sat on the stove with water gone dry. A toy truck lay on its side near the back door. A small sweater rested on the couch, sleeves folded in as if someone had set it down just minutes before. Everything looked normal, yet the normalness felt staged, like someone had tried too hard to make things look the way they should. People in town had always spoken carefully about the Fowlers. Harold had the kind of calm face that made it hard to know what he was thinking. Some thought he was simply quiet. Others felt something colder behind his eyes. June was the softer one, but even she carried a tension in her shoulders that never seemed to ease. Their children were polite but distant, strangely mature for their ages. They didn't run wild the way other kids did. They stood together, close, as if a private world existed between them that no one else was allowed to see. Most people blamed their distance on the isolation of the land. Some said Harold kept them too tightly controlled. Others said the children chose to stay apart. No one knew for sure. Before the deputies arrived that day, the Fowler property had always appeared steady, strange maybe, but steady. The family planted their fields on schedule. They came into town for groceries about once a week. Harold handled business with a stern, clipped tone, and June offered small, tired smiles that were polite but never warm. If anything was wrong inside that home, no one outside had ever gotten close enough to see it. But there were whispers, small things said with a low voice. The kids were too quiet. That Harold didn't like neighbors dropping by. The children didn't always look like they had slept well. Nothing loud enough to raise alarms, but enough to make people wonder. What the deputies couldn't shake that day was the feeling that the house hid something. Not loudly, not violently, but calmly, as if it had practiced. The children's beds were made. Their clothes hung neatly in the small closet. There was no sign they had packed anything or run away. It was like they had simply been lifted out of their lives without warning. And underneath that unsettling emptiness was something else. A strange sense of pressure, as if the room held a story too heavy for the air to carry. Before the crime, before the house went quiet, the family had lived with an odd rhythm that didn't match anyone else. Harold liked routine. He liked control. He spoke to his children with a voice that rarely changed, even when they made mistakes. June followed his lead, though her eyes sometimes told a different story, something tired, something scared, something locked away. The children, for all their quietness, carried moods that didn't seem natural for their age. They watched people instead of playing. They listened more than they spoke, and they often looked at each other with expressions that adults couldn't understand, like they shared secrets deeper than childish fears. There were moments when neighbors felt something wrong in the way the family moved, how the children waited for Harold to speak first, how June seemed to flinch at loud noises, how the kids' smiles never quite reached their eyes. Nothing that proved danger, nothing that anyone could call the sheriff about, just small signs of a world controlled by something unseen, a house ruled by silence, a family held together by rules no one dared question. In that part of Wyoming, people minded their own business. They believed in respecting land and privacy. But even then, the Fowlers felt different, like they were living under some pressure no one else could name. Some thought it was strict parenting. Some thought it was loneliness. Others felt an uneasiness they couldn't explain. And when the children were found, When the truth finally surfaced, every quiet suspicion people had kept tucked away in their minds would suddenly make sense in ways that none of them were ready for. But on that early August morning, all anyone knew was that the house was too quiet, the children were gone, and nothing about the scene matched what life had looked like just a day before. The world around the Fowler property hadn't changed. The field still moved with the slow push of the wind. The sky still pressed down with its wide, blue heat. Yet everything felt broken, like the thin layer of normal the family had lived under had finally cracked. And once that crack opened, nothing would ever feel normal again. The weeks before the children went missing would later feel like a chain of moments no one noticed at the time. Small shifts in mood, strange incidents, quiet arguments carried through thin walls. But when stitched together, they showed a family sliding toward something dark. People in town would replay those moments in their heads again and again, wondering why they hadn't seen the pieces falling apart. But inside the Fowler home, the tension was so constant that it had begun to feel normal, like a storm that never quite broke but never went away. Harold had always carried a rigid sense of control, but that summer it sharpened into something harsher. He watched everything, from the way the children walked across the room to the way June folded laundry. He didn't raise his voice, not in the traditional sense. Instead, he used silence as a weapon, cutting deeper than any shouted words could. When he looked at someone, it was like he was waiting for them to make a mistake. The children felt it every day. They moved quickly, quietly, afraid to draw attention in a house where attention often led to punishment. But something had changed in Harold, too. His usual calm had grown colder. He'd sit at the kitchen table long after dinner, staring into nothing, his jaw tight. When June asked if something was wrong, he'd shake his head, but his eyes stayed distant. One night he didn't sleep. Instead, he paced through the house while the others pretended not to hear his footsteps. He'd stop outside each child's room, pausing for long seconds before moving on. It made the youngest, Sarah, pull her blanket over her head and whisper to her siblings that they shouldn't breathe too loudly. Her older brother, Mark, would tell her it was fine, but even he didn't sound sure. It wasn't just the house that was changing. The family's money troubles had grown worse. Harold's small business, which had once paid their bills, was failing. The stores in town were ordering less. People were choosing cheaper options. Some said Harold's temper had scared customers away. Others said the times were simply getting harder. But whatever the reason, he brought the stress home with him, his frustration simmering beneath every word. June tried to keep the peace, smoothing things over with half-smiles and quiet reassurances, but her efforts only stretched her thinner. She started to look like she was holding her breath all the time. One day in June, a neighbor noticed the middle child sitting alone on a rock near the back fence. She wasn't playing, she wasn't reading. She was staring at the house as if she was waiting for something she didn't want to come. When the neighbor didn't wave back. She just looked down and wrapped her arms around herself. The neighbor thought she might be sick, but before she could walk over to check, Harold stepped out onto the porch. He stared at her until she stood up and hurried back inside without a word. Later, the neighbor would admit she felt something wrong in that moment, but she couldn't explain why. All she knew was that the girl's eyes had looked scared in a way she couldn't forget. Inside the home, the children had begun whispering to each other late at night, trying to understand their father's growing pressure. They felt like bugs under glass, constantly watched, constantly measured. Mark, at 12, tried to be the brave one. He told his sisters that their father was just stressed, that things would calm down, but even he was starting to unravel. There were moments he snapped at his siblings over small things, then apologized immediately, his hands shaking. He was carrying fears no child should have to carry. Fears that he couldn't name out loud because numbing them might make them real. June felt the shift too. She tried to steady the family, but her efforts didn't soothe anything. The more she tried to calm Harold, the more distant he became. There was one night she quietly asked if they should get help, maybe talk to someone in town, maybe ask her sister for money. Harold froze, then told her to never bring it up again. His voice didn't rise, but something in it made June's heart drop. She realized then that whatever was happening inside him had grown past her reach. He wasn't just stressed or tired. Something deeper was eating away at him, something he refused to admit. June had her own secrets as well. Before she married Harold, she had dreams of leaving Wyoming, of studying nursing, of building a life where she wasn't afraid to speak her mind. But she gave those dreams up when she married him. She told herself love required sacrifice. She told herself she could build a good life here. She even convinced herself for a few years. But as Harold grew more controlling, she shrank, telling herself that if she stayed quiet, if she followed the rules, things would stay steady. Now, with the financial pressure building and Harold's temper sharpening, her old dreams returned, not as hopes, but as painful reminders of everything she had lost. The children weren't blind to their mother's fear. They saw how she flinched when Harold cleared his throat. They saw how she forced smiles at dinner. They saw how she pressed her hands together under the table to keep them from shaking. Sarah once asked her why she looked sad, and June brushed her hair and said she was just tired. But the children knew better. Kids always do. The turning point came in early July. Harold discovered that Mark had left the gate open one afternoon, allowing one of their animals to wander toward the road. Nothing bad happened. The animal was found quickly, but Harold didn't focus on the outcome. He fixated on the mistake. He made Mark stand in the yard for nearly an hour while he lectured him about responsibility, danger, and the consequences of careless actions. His words weren't loud, but they cut like blades. The girls watched from the window, their faces pale, as Mark stood frozen, his eyes locked on the ground. When Harold finally let him go inside, the boy walked straight to his room, closed the door, and didn't come out for hours. After that, the children started avoiding their father more. They woke earlier so they could do chores before he came downstairs. They stayed in their rooms more often. Even the sound of his footsteps made them stiffen. Harold noticed their distance, and it angered him in a quiet, controlled way. He'd make comments at dinner about loyalty, about family, about how children should respect their parents. The more distant they became, the more he tightened the invisible grip he had over them. And the more he tightened that grip, the more the children pulled away. There was another moment near the middle of July when June found Harold sitting in the barn, staring at the dirt floor. She gently asked what he was thinking about. He didn't answer at first. Then he said something that made her blood run cold. "Sometimes I wonder if the world would even notice if this family disappeared." He said it calmly, without emotion, like he was commenting on the weather. June stood frozen, unsure how to respond. She tried to laugh it off, saying the town cared about them. But he didn't look at her. He just shook his head and said, "People see what they want to see." June didn't sleep that night. She kept replaying his words, trying to understand what he meant. She wanted to believe he was just tired, but something in his voice had sounded final, like he'd already made up his mind about something. Meanwhile, the children were going through their own unraveling. Sarah started having nightmares, stopped talking as much, even to her siblings. Mark began to feel protective in a way that made him act older than he was, as if he were responsible for keeping everyone safe. He didn't trust their father's moods anymore. He didn't trust the silence in the house. He began listening at the door when Harold and June argued. He didn't always understand their words, but he understood their tones. Fear in June's voice, frustration in Harold's. There was a night when the three children sat together on the floor of Mark's room, whispering about running away. They didn't have a plan. They didn't know where they would go, but the idea came from a place of desperation, kept twisting her hands, saying she was scared something bad was going to happen. Sarah cried quietly, asking if it was her fault. Mark told them it wasn't anyone's fault, but his voice cracked. In that moment, the burden of protecting his sisters felt too heavy for a child to carry. As the days crawled toward August, everything inside the house tightened like a rope pulled too far. Harold grew unpredictable. One moment he was calm, the next he was muttering under his breath about failure, about disobedience, about things that didn't make sense. June tried to shield the children, but she was barely holding herself together. At night, she sat by their beds and smoothed their hair, whispering that everything would be okay even though she didn't believe it. Outside pressures kept stacking up. More bills arrived. The bank called twice. A man from town stopped by to ask when Harold planned to pay what he owed. Harold didn't answer him. He simply stared at the man until he left. Later, when June asked him what he planned to do, he told her she talked too much. That was all. Behind every small interaction lay something heavier. Past grievances Harold never let go of. Quiet resentments June buried deep. Secrets the children didn't understand, but felt the weight of. The family moved through each day like people walking along a cracking bridge, pretending it was stable even as the boards gave way beneath their feet. Then came the last argument, the one that echoed through the walls late one night in early August, the one the children listened to in silence, their hearts pounding. Harold accused June of turning the children against him. June told him his behavior was scaring them. Harold said she was weak. June said he was losing control of himself. Something crashed, maybe a chair, maybe a lamp. The children didn't know. They just pressed closer together, waiting for the sound of footsteps coming toward them. But the footsteps never came. Instead, there was silence, the kind that rings louder than shouting. The next morning, Harold acted calm, almost too calm. He made breakfast as if nothing had happened. He spoke to the children with a strange gentleness that made their stomachs twist. June kept her distance, her eyes darting toward him with quiet fear. No one mentioned the argument. No one dared. It was the final stretch before everything would break. The tension in the air felt like a held breath that had gone on too long. The children went through their chores with shaking hands. June washed dishes without looking up. Harold walked through the house with a steady, eerie calm. None of them knew they were standing on the edge of something irreversible. None of them knew that within days, the house would fall silent in a way no one could ever undo. And soon after, the world around them would learn the truth about what had happened inside that fragile home. Truths darker than anything anyone had imagined. Truths that would haunt the town for years. The rise in crime wasn't sudden. It was a slow, choking climb, built from every whispered fear, every hidden secret, every quiet moment where someone looked away instead of asking for help. And now, the breaking point was close enough to touch. The night everything snapped began without warning. The air outside was still, the kind of stillness that made sounds inside the house feel sharper, heavier. The sun had already dropped behind the hills, leaving the sky dim and muted. The Fowler home glowed faintly from the windows, but even that light felt weak, as if it knew something terrible was about to happen. Inside, the children sat close together in their bedroom, pretending to read. Their hands trembled each time the floor creaked under their father's weight. They could feel the tension in the house, the way someone feels a storm rolling in, quiet at first, but shifting the air in a way that made breathing harder. Harold was packing again. He had been packing for almost an hour, back and forth across the living room. June watched him from the kitchen doorway, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter so tightly her knuckles turned white. She felt something in him had broken. It wasn't anger anymore. It wasn't frustration. It was something colder, something almost empty. He didn't look at her when she tried to speak. He didn't look at anything except the floor, as if the answers to all his problems were hidden in the wood grain. The argument from the night before still hung heavy between them, even though neither had said a word about it today. June knew she should take the children and leave, but leaving felt impossible. She didn't know where they would go or how far Harold would follow. She didn't even know what he was capable of anymore. She kept telling herself they were safe for the moment, but deep down she felt a cold truth. The man standing in that living room was no longer the husband she had once trusted. When Harold finally stopped packing, he lifted his head and stared toward the hallway where the children's room sat. His eyes didn't look angry. They didn't look sad. They looked decisive. A chill ran through June so strong she had to brace herself. She whispered his name once softly, like saying it gently would bring him back to reality. But he didn't blink. He didn't move. He simply said in a low voice that felt too calm, "They don't listen anymore." June felt her stomach drop. She stepped in front of him, blocking his path without meaning to. Her voice shook when she spoke. "They're just scared, Harold. They're children. They haven't done anything wrong. Please just talk to them calmly." He looked at her, and in that moment she saw everything she had been afraid of. Not rage, but certainty. A man who believed he was doing something necessary, something he had convinced himself was justified. He stepped past her, and she reached for his arm, desperate to stop him. For a second he paused, a tiny second, and she thought maybe she had reached him. But then he pulled his arm away with a force that sent her stumbling. The children heard the thud when she hit the wall. Sarah gasped and grabbed his hand. Mark stood up, his heart pounding so hard he felt dizzy. He didn't know what would happen, but he knew they had to move. He told his sisters to get behind him as the footsteps came closer, slow and heavy, each one sending a shock of fear through the room. When the door opened, Harold stood in the doorway, his shadow stretching across the floor. The room felt smaller all of a sudden, like the walls had moved inward. Sarah began to cry quietly, froze. Mark swallowed hard and tried to stand tall, even though his legs shook. Harold didn't yell, he didn't rush toward them. He spoke in the same calm tone he had used at breakfast, the one that made everything feel worse. "Do you know what happens," he said, "when a family stops listening?" Mark shook his head slowly, his breath unsteady. His voice cracked when he answered, "Dad, we didn't do anything." Harold looked at him with an expression that almost resembled pity. "It's not about what you did, it's about what's coming. I can't let this family fall apart." Behind him, June appeared in the hallway. Her cheek was red where she'd hit the wall. She looked terrified, but she forced herself forward. "Harold," she said, her voice trembling, "stop, please, you're scaring them, you're scaring me." She reached for him again, and this time something in him snapped. He shoved her away harder than before, hard enough that she fell to the floor with a cry of pain. The children screamed, and that was the moment everything broke. The moment the house turned into something unrecognizable. June scrambled to her knees, desperate to get between him and the children. Harold stepped into the room, and for the first time that night his calm cracked. His face twisted with something wild, something that had been building for months. His voice rose into a strange shout. "You're ruining everything. You think I don't see it? You think I don't know what you've been doing?" June grabbed his arm again, tears streaking down her face. "They're your children. They're scared. Harold, please, please stop." Her words didn't reach him. They only pushed him further. His hand lashed out before he even seemed to realize what he was doing. The sound of the blow echoed off the walls, sharp and awful. June collapsed again, clutching her face, gasping for air. The children screamed louder. Sarah tried to run to her mother, but Harold grabbed her by the arm. She shrieked in pain, her small body shaking, tried to pull her away, but she couldn't. Mark lunged forward, hitting his father's arm with all the strength his 12-year-old body had. It wasn't enough. Harold pushed him back with ease, sending him sprawling into the corner. Everything turned frantic. Every sound was too loud, every movement is too fast. The room felt thick, like the air itself was choking them. Harold dragged Sarah toward him, shouting words that didn't make sense. Something about protecting them, something about fixing things, something about the world not caring if they disappeared. His grip tightened until she screamed in sheer agony. June forced herself up again. Blood dripped from her lip. Her legs nearly gave out, but she pushed herself toward him anyway, screaming his name. She grabbed the closest object she could, one of the children's small metal lamps, and swung it with shaking hands. It struck his shoulder, not enough to injure him, but enough to make him drop Sarah. He turned on June with a look that froze her in place. A look that didn't belong to a man anymore, but to something hollowed out. Mark rushed forward again, tackling his father's leg in a desperate attempt to slow him down. Grabbed Sarah and pulled her back toward the bed. The room was chaos, screams, sobs, bodies scrambling across the floor. Harold yanked Mark up by his shirt, lifting him off the ground as the boy kicked and twisted, trying to escape. June screamed and tried hitting Harold again, but he shoved her so hard this time that she didn't get back up quickly. The next moments blurred together, pain, fear, desperate breaths. Harold's rage had fully erupted. He wasn't thinking. He wasn't listening. He was acting on something twisted inside him, something fed by pressure, obsession, and the belief that losing control meant losing everything. By the time the struggle was over, the room had fallen unbearably silent again. Sarah's sobs had quieted, was curled beside her, shaking so violently she couldn't form words. Mark lay on the floor, dazed and barely conscious. And June, battered and trembling, crawled toward her children, pulling them close even though she could barely lift her arms. Harold stepped back, looking at what he had done. For the first time that night, he seemed to see the room clearly. His breathing slowed. His eyes shifted from rage to something else, shock, confusion, maybe even regret. His hands shook. He whispered something like, "I didn't mean," but the words died in his throat. The silence that followed was thick with horror. No one moved except June, who gathered her children against her chest, checking their faces, whispering their names. Harold stared at his hands as if trying to understand how they had become weapons. But the moment passed, and instead of rushing to them, instead of helping, instead of begging for forgiveness, Harold backed away. Then he turned. Then he walked out of the room without a single word. June listened to the slow footsteps down the hallway. The front door opened, closed, and then there was nothing, no sound at all. The aftermath inside the house felt unreal. The children were injured but alive. June held them, crying quietly, unsure whether Harold would come back, unsure whether they needed to run, unsure what would happen next. Her mind raced through questions she couldn't answer. Should she get the car? Should she hide with the children? Should she call for help, even though the nearest neighbor lived miles away? Minutes felt like hours. She didn't know then what Harold was planning. She didn't know he wasn't finished. And she didn't know that when this night ended, the house would be left in a silence far deeper than the one she felt now. A silence that the sheriff's deputies would step into days later. A silence holding the truth that would shake the town to its core. The hours after Harold walked out of the house felt unreal, like time had stopped moving the way it was supposed to. June sat on the bedroom floor, holding the children close, listening for any sign of him returning. Every small sound made her tense, wind against the siding, the settling of the wooden boards, the distant creak of a tree branch. She kept imagining his silhouette reappearing in the doorway, his voice turning cold again. She didn't dare move the children too far or too fast. She only knew they needed to stay quiet and stay close. Mark drifted in and out of consciousness, his breath shallow and shaky. Sarah cried until she had no voice left, and then her body shook in silent sobs, stayed alert, her eyes fixed on the door as if her fear alone might hold it shut. June checked their injuries with trembling hands, whispering calming words she didn't believe. Her heart felt crushed between terror and guilt. She kept replaying the moment she had tried to stop Harold. What if she had held onto him longer? What if she had spoken differently? What if she had left sooner, months earlier, even years earlier? Maybe none of this would have happened. As night deepened, the house grew colder. June made a decision she should have made earlier. She gathered enough strength to get the children to the car. She didn't grab many things, just a blanket, her keys, and a small bag of clothes that was near the door. Every step through the hallway felt like walking through a memory she wanted to forget. A door Harold had slammed shut earlier remained cracked open, swinging slightly with the breeze from the open window. It made her chest tighten. Outside, the darkness felt thick and suffocating. June kept scanning the tree line as she helped the children into the car. Mark was barely awake but managed to sit upright, held Sarah close, whispering that they would be okay. June started the engine with shaking hands and drove down the dirt road without looking back. She didn't want to see the house one more time, not like that, not with the fear that Harold was still inside watching her leave. She drove to the nearest ranch miles away. When she arrived, the porch light flicked on and an older couple stepped outside, confused at first but quickly understanding something terrible had happened. They helped her inside, wrapped the children in warm blankets and urged her to sit. But June couldn't sit. She couldn't stop shaking. Her voice broke as she tried to explain. The couple called the sheriff, speaking in low, urgent tones. When the deputies arrived, their faces shifted from confusion to concern to something close to dread. They asked June where Harold had gone. She could only shake her head. They asked what exactly had happened. She tried to speak, but her words kept tangling, her breath catching as she relived the panic. One of the deputies gently told her to take her time. She finally managed to describe the argument, the blows, the children's screams, the way Harold had walked out afterward as if he had detached himself from reality. The children clung to each other as the deputies asked them simple questions. Where did it hurt? Did they see where their father went? Did he have anything with him when he left? Sarah cried the moment anyone spoke to her, answered calmly at first, but her voice cracked halfway through and she into silence. Mark, still dizzy, gave short answers, his eyes distant. Doctors later confirmed the children's injuries, bruises, cuts, and marks from tight grabbing. Mark had a mild concussion. June had a fractured cheekbone. The physical injuries were treatable. The emotional ones were harder to measure. Over the next days, the sheriff's department searched for Harold. They drove through back roads, checked abandoned barns, questioned neighbors, and followed every tip they received. No one found him. No one had even seen him after he walked out of the house. It was as if he had disappeared into the empty land around the property. People wondered if he had run away. Others whispered darker possibilities, that he had hidden somewhere nearby, watching, waiting. News of the attack spread quickly across the small town, faster than law enforcement could contain it. Everyone knew the Fowler family, at least by name. People had always thought Harold was strict but respectable. They had seen June's shy smiles in the market. They had watched the children play in the yard before their world turned dark. Hearing what happened shattered the image they had held. Some were shocked. Others admitted they had always felt something was off. Still others judged June, saying she should have left long ago, not understanding the quiet fear she had lived under. Reporters came from nearby cities, standing outside the sheriff's office, asking for statements. Some townspeople avoided them. Others didn't hesitate to share their theories, some helpful, others cruel. The Fowler home became a symbol of a broken family, of hidden violence, of how people could overlook warning signs when the truth was too uncomfortable. June tried to stay away from the noise. She spent her days with the children in a small guest room at the ranch, sitting beside their beds, brushing their hair, whispering stories to keep their minds from drifting into the terror they had lived through. But when she closed her eyes, she heard everything again, the shouts, the blows, the sound of the lamp hitting his shoulder, the final silence. She wanted to sleep, but sleep brought nightmares. She wanted to be strong for her children, but she felt she was falling apart inside. There was a moment one afternoon when Mark asked her why their father had changed. She didn't have an answer. She wanted to tell him that Harold had loved them once, that something inside him had twisted over time. But all she could do was hold Mark's hand and say, "It wasn't your fault. None of it was your fault." Mark nodded, but she could tell he didn't believe her. Guilt clung to him like a shadow he couldn't shake. The sheriff's investigation kept circling the same few questions. What had pushed Harold so far? Where had he gone? Was he planning to return? Deputies found signs that he had taken supplies with him, canned food, a flashlight, a heavy coat, suggesting he intended to stay away for a while. But beyond that, they had nothing. Some believed he was hiding in the woods, others thought he had taken his own life. No one knew for certain. As the days turned into a week, the town grew restless. Parents held their children, people double-checked their locks. The thought of a man losing control so violently haunted everyone. The Fowler house sat empty, taped off, the windows dark. A few brave neighbors peered inside when deputies weren't around. They saw overturned furniture, scattered toys, and blood-stained fabric. They walked away quickly, shaken. The emotional toll spread beyond the family. June's sister arrived from another town, heartbroken at the sight of her sister's injuries and the children's fear. She blamed herself for not visiting sooner. The ranch couple who had helped them couldn't stop replaying the night June arrived at their door, trembling and bruised. People who had once greeted Harold with friendly nods now spoke of him in hushed tones, unsure whether to view him as a monster or a man who had collapsed under too much pressure. June was interviewed by detectives several times. Each time she had to recount the night, she felt pieces of herself crumble. She tried to stay steady, but the guilt pressed on her relentlessly. She kept thinking about the look in Harold's eyes before he walked out, the mix of shock and regret. Part of her wondered if he had realized what he had done, if he had gone somewhere to face it or run from it entirely. The children's healing was slow. Sarah clung to June constantly, afraid to be more than a few steps away, barely spoke for days. Mark grew quiet, withdrawn, burdened by questions he couldn't understand or voice. They all jumped at sudden sounds. They all had trouble sleeping. Their innocence, once fragile, now felt shattered. The town tried to help. People dropped off food, blankets, and letters. A local teacher offered to tutor the children privately until things settled. But the kindness didn't erase the weight of what had happened. The community struggled to reconcile the image of Harold Fowler, once seen as a father, with the man who had nearly destroyed his own family. Some whispered about the children's strange behaviors in the weeks before the attack, trying to make sense of it. Others speculated that Harold had been dealing with hidden mental illness or overwhelming financial stress. The rumors grew, blending fear with judgment, until the truth felt tangled in a web of assumptions. As the investigation dragged on, the sheriff met with June privately. He told her they might never find Harold, that the land was too vast, and he had too much of a head start. June nodded, but inside she felt cold. The idea of never getting answers terrified her almost as much as the idea of him returning one day. She didn't know which future she feared more. When she finally returned to the Fowler house with the deputies to collect what little she needed, she stepped inside slowly, her breath caught in her throat. The house felt hollow, as if the violence had drained it of all warmth. She saw the scuff marks on the walls, the lamp dented near the children's bed, the overturned chair. She walked through each room quietly, her hands trembling. The memories clung to every corner. She couldn't stay inside for long. The aftermath of that night settled over everyone like a heavy fog, thick, unshakable, and filled with things left unsaid. The crime had broken more than bones and furniture. It had fractured trust, shattered a family, and left a town questioning how something so dark could grow unnoticed for so long. And in all the silence that followed, only one question remained louder than all the others. Where was Harold Fowler now? And what would happen if he came back? The years that followed never truly brought peace, only distance. People moved on because they had to, because life had its own demands, but the memory of what happened in those woods never softened. It stayed sharp, almost cold, like a truth no one wanted to look at for too long. When the courts finally handed down their decision, it felt less like justice and more like a tired attempt to place order on something that had been broken from the start. Names were read, sentences were given, and the room was filled with a strange quiet, one that didn't feel like closure but like exhaustion. Some of the individuals involved walked away with heavy punishments, while others slipped through gaps that had always existed for people like them. Influence, reputation, and carefully shaped public images played their part. Some families argued that the verdict was fair, while others saw it as proof that the system wasn't built equally for all. The ones who had tried to keep distance from the Fowler clan found themselves pulled back into the story as witnesses, reminders of how deeply the family's secrets had reached into the community. Those who survived the ordeal were never the same. A few tried to rebuild their lives somewhere far away, but even then the past followed them. It appeared in the way they spoke, in the way they avoided certain memories, in the way they became startled at small things that resembled the chaos of that night. They carried guilt even when they had nothing to be guilty for. And those who did play a part carried something worse, an understanding of their own choices, a knowledge of how thin the line between fear and cruelty had been for them. Some tried to push it down, calling it a mistake, a lapse in judgment, something that happened too fast to stop. But late at night, when everything was quiet, they felt the truth rise again, whispering in ways they couldn't avoid. Public reaction came in waves. At first, there was shock. People didn't know what to do with the details that slowly came out, the strange mix of cruelty, superstition, and fear that shaped the entire tragedy. It became a storm of anger, curiosity, and disbelief. Reporters dug through every scrap of background, neighbors offered stories they once kept to themselves, and strangers pretended to understand things they couldn't truly grasp. For a while, the Fowler name became something heavy, something people whispered and argued about. It was strange how quickly communities turned on someone they once embraced, as if they needed to find distance from the horror to feel safe again. But in the middle of that uproar, some people remembered the good moments, the times before everything shifted. They talked about how fast love could turn into resentment, how easily pride could twist into control, and how mental strain could grow unnoticed inside someone who seemed completely fine. Their voices weren't as loud as the public outrage, but they held a different kind of truth, the understanding that the crime didn't come from nowhere. It came from years of fear, silence, and mistakes that slowly built on top of each other. Some questioned whether justice had been served at all. Legally, yes, there were outcomes. People went to prison, records were sealed, lives were marked forever. But the deeper sense of justice, the kind tied to healing or understanding, never found its place. The damage stretched too far, touching people who had no part in the events but who were connected through friendship, trust, or blood. It showed how one act of violence wasn't a single moment. It was a wave that kept moving, breaking over everyone in its path long after the first impact. As the years passed, the story settled into the community like an old scar. People didn't talk about it as often, but the memory stayed in the background, shaping the way they saw certain things, family secrets, sudden anger, the fragile balance inside relationships. It made some people more cautious, more aware of what silence could hide. Others became more careful with their own emotions, noticing signs of stress or fear earlier than before. And some tried to push the entire thing out of their minds, pretending it never happened, though deep down they knew that tragedies didn't disappear simply because someone avoided speaking about them. Looking back, it became clear that the crime had uncovered more than a single terrible act. It showed how power worked inside families, how fear could be used to control, how love could become a weapon in the wrong hands. It exposed the way communities sometimes overlook warning signs because it's easier to believe everything is fine. And it revealed something unsettling about human nature, the ability to justify nearly anything when we feel cornered or afraid. The case raised difficult questions about morality. What makes someone cross the line? How much responsibility falls on a person shaped by a lifetime of pressure or emotional manipulation? At what point does fear stop being a reason and become an excuse? There weren't simple answers. People argued about them long after the court case ended. Some believed that every person involved should carry full blame, no matter what shaped them. Others thought the real failure started long before the crime, in the patterns of silence and control that were allowed to grow unchecked. Over time, the Fowler case became more than a tragedy. It became a lesson the town never forgot. It forced people to confront the truth that darkness doesn't always show itself openly. Sometimes it hides in routine moments, in words spoken too sharply, in secrets kept to maintain peace, in the slow erosion of trust. And it reminded everyone that justice is complicated because people are complicated. Even those who commit terrible acts are not born from nothing. They're shaped by their histories, their fears, and the world around them. In the end, there was no neat resolution. The people involved carried their outcomes: prison, guilt, broken relationships, distance, rebuilding. The community carried its own: fear, caution, change. And the story lived on because it held all the things people try to understand but rarely can. Love twisted into something dangerous, fear growing into violence, and the fragile line between control and protection. The final truth was simple but heavy. No one walked away untouched. No one could undo what had happened. And for everyone who remembered the Fowler clan, the tragedy became a quiet reminder that even the strongest families can break, and even the places can hide shadows deep enough to change everything.